In the story as it's most often told, everything turned on the fifth day, when the Karluks changed sides and one of Tang China's great western armies was shattered on the Talas River, deep in Central Asia. The year was 751. On one side stood the army of Tang China, at the height of one of China's golden ages. On the other stood the soldiers of the Abbasid Caliphate, at the dawn of the Islamic Golden Age. Their armies had never met before. After Talas they never would again. And here's what almost everyone gets wrong. This battle is remembered as an ending. The day two civilizations collided, the day China was thrown out of the West for good. It's very nearly the opposite of the truth. The most important part of this story isn't the fight, it's everything that kept crossing between these two worlds long after it. Envoys, soldiers, music, a sheet of paper, and one man who marched out with one army and came home having lived for years inside the other. Two empires, two golden ages, one river. This is the forgotten battle between them and the road that outlived it. Before we get to the fight, you need to know who was standing on each side of that river, because these weren't just two armies. They were two of the most powerful imperial states on Earth. Not one road, but a shifting network of caravan routes, ports, markets, and middlemen had long carried envoys, merchants, and news between their worlds. It had simply never placed their armies on the same battlefield. And when it finally did, the soldiers came not all the way from each capital, but from the frontier forces each empire kept out in Central Asia. Start in the east with the Tang. By the early 700s it ran an empire of maybe 5 million square kilometers and 50 million people, by some estimates close to a quarter of everyone alive. The Tang pushed aggressively westward deep into Central Asia, but the traffic ran both ways. While their armies pushed out, the world came pouring into their capital. And what a capital! Behind walls of packed earth, more than 1 million people lived inside Chang'an, and the wider metropolitan prefecture around it held far more. In 742, a census of that whole capital region counted 362,921 households, close to 2 million people. At that moment, even the largest cities of Western Europe were only a fraction of Chang'an's size. It was one of the largest cities on Earth, and it was packed with the world. Persian wine shops served poets like Li Bai. Sogdian traders led camels in off the desert. Foreign monks, envoys, and musicians filled the avenues, many of them arriving through the trade routes from the west. Now the other side. The Abbasids had just taken power in 750, 1 year before our battle, inheriting one of the largest empires the world had ever seen, a domain earlier caliphs had carved out from Persia across North Africa and into Spain. They would soon build a capital to match Chang'an, Baghdad, founded in 762, a perfect circle of walls that within 2 generations may have held close to 1 million people and become one of the richest cities on earth. Down its river came goods that had travelled all the way from China, carried up the Gulf and along the trade networks that stitched the two worlds together. Two giants, two of the greatest cities that had ever existed, and the routes running between them, already busy with silk and camels and travellers, long before either army marched. In 751 they brought the two empires face to face. It started the way these things often do, with a disputed frontier intervention. Not a clash of civilizations, not a holy war, and not on empty ground. because the Talas Valley was not a blank arena where two superpowers happened to meet. It was home for the Sogdian merchants whose caravans had run these routes for centuries, for the Turkic clans grazing these hills, for oasis kingdoms like Chash and Fergana that had bought, sold and bargained their way between bigger neighbours for generations. This was the centre of the world, not the edge of anyone else's. Central Asia in 751 was its own crowded arena, fought over by the Tang, the Abbasids and the Tibetans all at once. Central Asian alliances would help decide the battle itself, and Central Asian communities would bear its consequences long after the great powers moved on. Here the main account we have is the Chinese one. It says that in 750 the Tang commander out west, a brilliant general of Korean descent named Gao Xianji, moved against the small kingdom of Chash, near modern Tashkent. The king surrendered. Gao Xianji took him prisoner anyway, sent him back to be executed, and looted the city. The dead king's son, so the Chinese sources tell it, ran west and asked the new power beyond the Siadaria for help. The Abbasids came. In July of 751 the two forces met in the Talas River Valley. The numbers that survive are all over the map. Chinese sources claim the enemy fielded 200,000. Later Arabic chronicles claim the Chinese fielded 100,000. Both are almost certainly wild exaggerations. One widely cited reconstruction puts Gao Xianji's coalition at roughly 30,000, including a large contingent of Karluk Turks, but the real figures remain uncertain. Facing them stood an Abbasid-led army of similar size, maybe bigger. Nobody really knows. The two armies faced off for several days, and neither could break the other. Then the Karluks turned. In the version most often told, they switched sides in the middle of the fight, striking the Tang from behind while the Abbasids pushed from the front. Other historians argue the Karluks may have been aligned with the Abbasids all along, and were never really fighting for the Tang. Either way, caught between two forces, the Tang army fell apart. The Chinese histories put the cost in brutal terms. Of the tens of thousands who marched out, the dead were past counting, and barely 2,000 made it home, pulled clear by a rearguard stand under an officer named Li Si. Later Arabic chronicles give much larger figures, tens of thousands killed, 20,000 or more taken prisoner. Two sets of numbers from two sides that will never fully line up, so the Abbasids won. And here's the question everyone asks next, the one the history books love. Was this the battle where China lost Central Asia for good? The short answer is no, at least not the way it's usually told. Talas did not immediately erase Tang power in Central Asia. Chat returned to Tang vassalage. Tang forces stayed active beyond the Pamirs, and several western kingdoms kept asking the Tang court for military help. What ultimately pulled the Tang back from the west came later, and it came from home. In 755, the Anlushan Rebellion, one of the most devastating civil wars in human history, tore the empire apart. In the decades that followed, Tibetan armies seized the Hexi corridor and cut the Tang off from their own garrisons in the far west. That combination, not one lost battle abroad, is what cost the Tang their western reach. Talas was almost a footnote by comparison, and now the part that breaks the whole clash of civilizations story in half. The fighting stopped, but the traffic between the two empires didn't. In the years after Talas, Abbasid envoys arrived at the Tang court again and again. Two empires that had just bled each other went right back to sending missions, exchanging gifts and talking. there's an even stranger thread. Chinese records place soldiers they call dashi, men from the Arab world, inside the Tang armies during the rebellion. Whether they were troops sent by the caliph or fighters already in the region looking for work is something historians still argue about, but the shape of it is clear. Within a few years of the battle, men from the Abbasid world were fighting on the Tang side, not against it. And here's my favourite detail of the whole story. In the year 758, two foreign delegations arrived at the Tang court on the same day. Envoys from the Abbasid Caliphate and envoys from the Uyghurs, the steppe power that was helping the Tang survive its rebellion. The two argued right there at the palace over which of them should enter first. In the end, the Tang solved it by sending both delegations through separate gates at the same moment, so neither had to walk in behind the other. 7 years after Talas, the problem at the Tang court wasn't keeping the Abbasids out. It was receiving them without slighting either side. That's the reality the battle stories leave out. Talas wasn't a wall slammed down between two civilizations. It was one bloody stretch inside a relationship that kept right on going, trading, negotiating, jostling for status at court, for a long time afterward. On the Silk Road, you could bleed each other 1 year and send envoys the next. That was normal. So if the battle didn't close the road between these two worlds, what did that road keep carrying? Almost everything. Both of these empires faced the same challenge and opportunity. Routes that never stopped bringing in strangers, foreign goods, and foreign ideas. What they did with all that difference is one of the most interesting things about them, and it's usually told as a contrast. It's better told as two emphases. Chang'an wore its pluralism in the open. Walk the city and you'd pass the temples of half the world's faiths. Around 90 Buddhist monasteries. A Christian church built by Nestorian missionaries in 638. Zoroastrian fire temples, and a Manichaean hall. Muslim merchants were also beginning to appear in the city. The Tang were also prodigious translators in their own right, rendering vast libraries of Buddhist scripture from Sanskrit and several Central Asian languages. Difference lived in the streets and in the temples. Baghdad took that same openness and poured it into scholarship. Under the early Abbasid caliphs, the city became the hub of a vast translation movement, funded not by any single school but by caliphs, courtiers, wealthy families, and scholars from many linguistic and religious communities, including Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Greek philosophy, Persian statecraft, Indian mathematics, Syriac medicine, gathered from across the known world and turned into Arabic. The House of Wisdom was one famous institution associated with that much larger effort, a name that still sounds almost mythical. And out of that effort came people like Al-Khwarizmi, working in Baghdad in the early 800s. One of his book titles, Al-Jabr, gives us the word algebra. The Latin form of his name gives us another, algorithm. These weren't opposite systems, Chang'an's and Baghdad's. They were two different things you could do with a world that kept arriving at your door. And here's a part a lot of us never learned. Greek works translated, studied, and expanded in the Islamic world later entered medieval Latin scholarship through several routes. Arabic and Syriac-speaking scholars from Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and other communities all contributed, while Greek texts also kept circulating through Byzantium. For a long stretch of the Middle Ages, some of the surest paths for an old Greek idea to reach the future ran straight through Baghdad. The routes weren't just moving silk, they were moving knowledge. And if you want the most intimate proof of all, listen to the music. In Tang, musicians played the pear-shaped pipa, then usually with a plectrum. In Baghdad, the oud held a similarly prominent place at the heart of court music. Both belonged to a wider family of West and Central Asian lutes, adapted in different directions. To us, these two worlds can look like strangers. Their music tells another story. And the road carried people too. Which brings us back to the man I told you to remember. Remember the man I mentioned at the very beginning? The one who marched out with one army and came home having lived inside the other empire. Here he is. His name was Du Huan. He was a younger relative of the scholar Du Yu, who would later compile the Tongdian, a great institutional history of China. Du Huan had marched west with Gao Xianzhi's army, and at Talas he was captured. Instead of disappearing from the historical record, he spent the next 10 years or so, maybe 12, moving through the Abbasid world, across Central Asia, through the Middle East, along the shores of the Mediterranean. He's often described as one of the first people from China ever to reach the coast of Africa and leave a written record of it, and right he did. Around 762, the same year Baghdad was being founded, Du Huan sailed home by sea, landing at the southern port of Guangzhou, and composed an account of what he had seen in a book called the Jingxingji, the Record of Travels. Most of it is lost. What survives is a fragment, roughly 1,700 Chinese characters, quoted in 7 places inside his relative's Tongdian. But what a fragment! One of the earliest surviving accounts in Chinese of the customs of the Muslim world, written by a man who lived inside it. And tucked into that fragment is a detail that stays with you. In a city of the Caliphate, Du Huan writes, he came across other Chinese people, craftsmen, living and working far from home. He even named some painters and silk weavers. Chinese hands at work in the heart of the Islamic world, a few years after the two empires had supposedly turned their backs on each other. Whether they'd been taken at Talas or had come some other way, the fragment doesn't say. But there they were. The road ran both directions. Back at the start, I said you probably heard that Talas handed paper to the world. Here's that story in full. At the battle, the Abbasids captured Chinese paper makers, hauled them west, forced out the secret, and that's how paper reached the Islamic world and eventually Europe, clearing the way to the Renaissance. One battle, one lucky capture, and the course of human knowledge bends. It's a great story. It's also almost certainly not the whole truth. Look at the evidence in order. Paper was already being used and probably made in Central Asia before 751. The tale of captured paper makers shows up only much later, not in any account from the time of the battle, and no surviving contemporary source from either empire records such a handover at all. The scholar Jonathan Bloom, who studied this as closely as anyone, describes the spread of paper not as a single dramatic moment but as a slow process stretching across centuries. Even the methods drifted apart as it travelled. By the 8th century, many Chinese papers relied on bast fibres, while the paper that spread across the Islamic world came to rely on rags and cloth. Exactly what you'd expect from a craft that localized as it moved, rather than one secret stolen in an afternoon. So Talas was almost certainly not the single cause. It became a symbol. One sharp scene later storytellers used to explain a slow, centuries-long process. And that's the real heart of it. These two empires met in battle exactly once. It decided a campaign. It did not decide the future of Central Asia, and it did not end the relationship between the two worlds. What connected them was never the sword. The routes carried related loots east and west, where they developed into instruments such as the pipa and the oud. It was the paper that spread too slowly for any battle to explain. It was the envoys who kept coming, and one captured traveller who came home and set down what he had seen. More than 12 centuries later, the traffic still hasn't stopped. We write on paper's descendants. We solve for x in Al-Khwarizmi's algebra. Somewhere right now, someone is plucking a pear-shaped loot, east or west, and it hardly matters which. Baghdad grew far beyond Al-Mansur's original round city, becoming a capital of gardens and hospitals, scholars and libraries. 5 centuries later, it would be sacked so thoroughly that people still call it one of the darkest days in the history of learning. That's a story for another episode. But it's why, when people today try to picture a lost golden age, Baghdad is one of the first cities they name. A city we mostly know through the memory of how bright it once was. And the name outlived the empire. In some older Cantonese-speaking diaspora communities, in the historic Chinatowns of cities like San Francisco and Vancouver, you can still find traces of a particular word for a Chinese person. Tongyan, people of Tang, and Tongyan Gai, street of the Tang people. The empire fell more than 1,000 years ago, yet the name it left behind still lingers, an ocean away, long after the dynasty itself has disappeared. We remember Talas as an ending. It wasn't. 2 empires met in battle once, on a river neither called home. Their envoys kept coming for generations, and the wider networks outlived both dynasties. The battle is the part everybody remembers. The routes between them are the part that mattered. You're watching Atlas of Ages. This has been the story of the day 2 golden ages met, and everything that kept crossing between them long after.